Right, well, we've got three speakers today, so I need to get on with the introductions and let them get started, but I'll just very briefly introduce the three of them in the order they're going to speak. So first of all is Professor Atsushi Nishida, and he is the director of the Center of Social Science and Medicine at the Tokyo Metropolitan Institute of Medical Science, and he's also a visiting professor at the University of Tokyo. And he's involved in various projects, but he's the principal investigator of the team looking at the Tokyo Teen Cohort, which is a study that's been collecting data from young people in Tokyo since 2012. Then our second speaker is Dan Stanyon, who is well known to us at the Daiwa Foundation because he was the recipient of a Daiwa Scholarship in 2019. So we sent Dan to Japan for a year and a half on the Daiwa Scholarship, and he ended up staying there for more like 4 years in total. He's currently a PhD student at the Department of Health Services and Population Research at King's College London. While he was in Tokyo, he was working at the Tokyo Metropolitan Institute of Medical Science, presumably with Atsushi, on this Tokyo Teen Cohort study. So he's doing exactly what we hope Daiwa scholars will do, and forging links between the UK and Japan. And Dr. Gemma Knowles is the UK end of the link, and she is lecturer in epidemiology and youth mental health at the Centre for Society and Mental Health at King's London. And she, like Atsushi, is leading on a large study. So hers is the REACH study, Resilience, Ethnicity and Adolescent Mental Health, which is a similar cohort study of over 4,000 youth in South London. And so they've started working together, or at least comparing the results, and that's largely what we're going to be hearing about. So without any further ado, I will pass over to Atsushi to give his presentation.
Thank you, Jason, for your kind introduction. And I'm also grateful to the Daiwa Foundation for giving me a chance to talk here today. So my name is Atsushi Nishida, the Director of Research Center for Social Science and Medicine at the Tokyo Metropolitan Institute of Medical Science. And my main research area is public health and public health policy. Particularly, youth mental health is my most important research priority. Today, I would like to briefly talk about the current situation of mental health among young people in Japan and introduce some parts of our research. First, let me tell you a little about my research institute and research team. The name of our institute is very long and difficult to remember. The Tokyo Metropolitan Institute of Medical Science, which has been founded by the Tokyo Metropolitan Government. In this institute, I am belonging and leading the Research Center for Social Science and Medicine, where public health research is promoted. Our research center has a role in supporting the Tokyo Metropolitan Government to develop evidence-based public health policy. We work regularly and frequently with policymakers and place great importance on translating research findings into policy. Yes, our major research themes are here. Developing evidence-based prevention strategy for child abuse, school bullying, and adolescent mental health problems, and developing evidence-based early intervention program for people with dementia and psychosis, and the dissemination of this new prevention program based on the implementation science. And we place great importance on international collaboration. In particular, we keep a very strong collaborative relationship with Center for Society and Mental Health at King's College London. Every year, both research centers visit each other's research centers to improve the quality of our collaborative work. Gemma and Dan, who are participating in the symposium today, are our very important international colleagues. Okay. So I would like to share some information about the psychosocial characteristic of recent young people, current young people in Japan. Okay. So this is a part of the result of international survey conducted by the Nippon Foundation in 2022. This is a survey targeting 18-year-old young people from 6 countries, including Japan, India, the United States, and the United Kingdom. In this survey, Japan has the highest percentage of young people who said, "I feel anxious and depressed in daily life." The next slide is also one result of the same survey. Unfortunately, Japan is a country with the lowest percentage of young people who answered, "I look forward to my future." This is a low percentage compared to other countries, especially India and China. Many young people in our countries seem to find it difficult to have hope for their future. And this is also a result of the same survey. India is a country with the highest percentage of young people who say, "I believe that I can change my country and society through my action," while Japan is a country with the lowest percentage. Young people in Japan seem to find it difficult to act on their own to change the social environment. And this is a trend in the suicide rate among teenagers in Japan. Since around 2010, the suicide rate in Japan as a whole has been decreasing, but only the rate among teenagers uniquely continued to increase. In Japan, the number of reported cases of bullying victimization has significantly increased over the past decade. Due to the temporary school closure caused by the outbreak of COVID-19, the number of bullying victimization decreased, but it has started to increase again since schools reopened. The number of bullying cases in elementary and junior high school is particularly on the rise. So additionally, in recent years in our country, the number of children not attending school has increasing significantly. In particular, the increasing trend has become even more remarkable since the outbreak of COVID-19. Many children who do not attend school experience bullying victimization in elementary school or junior high school. Based on such many statistics, the mental health condition of Japanese teenager might be not good, poor compared to other countries, and may even be worsening in recent years. To improve the mental health of young people in our country, I think taking a closer look at their development and their environment and the interaction between them is very important. We launched the Tokyo Teen Cohort Study about 10 years before to investigate the developmental process of adolescents living in Tokyo. This is a population-based adolescent cohort study of about 3,000 children randomly sampled from the residential registry of 3 municipalities in Tokyo. The Tokyo Teen Cohort has so far conducted 5 surveys. Now we are conducting the age 20-year-old survey, which is the 5th wave, and about half of the survey has already been completed. Many of the participants are now university or college students. Because we place great value on our engagement with participants, we have succeeded in reducing the number of children who drop out our follow-up study. Through some combined effort, we can keep a relatively high follow-up rate. For example, we visit families who have moved out of Tokyo and send handwritten birthday cards to every children every year. Such a kind of effort have allowed us to maintain a high follow-up rate even in Tokyo, where population movement is high. Yes, our cohort data bank has accumulated a lot of biopsychosocial information about the youth development. Using these data, we have already published over 70 scientific papers to date. And brain victimization is a significant risk factor for mental health problems in adolescents. In Tokyo Teen Cohort study, we are investigating the long-term and physical and mental health damage that bullying can cause to children. Based on the research finding in the UK, it is suggested that the impact of bullying continue for a very long time, for 5 decades, even once the bullying itself has stopped. In other words, the after effects of bullying may cause people to suffer for a long time. Therefore, it is important to prevent bullying itself and take care of the after effect of being bullied. Recently, we have found that being bullied during adolescence may accelerate the pace of aging in young people. The retina, which is a part of the optic nerve circuit, is one of the first areas in the whole body to be affected by aging. And yes, so our research findings suggested that bullying victimization in primary and secondary school might lead to retinal thinning at age 20. But this association might be reduced if one experiences a positive school climate in high school. Can I hear? Okay. Yes, but this association might be reduced if one experiences a positive school climate in high school. A positive school climate in high school could buffer the potential damage inherent in children who were bullied in their early teens. Okay. Sorry. It's a retina thickness, and if adolescent experiences being bullied in the early age of early teenage, but they experience a good positive school climate in high school years. School years here. So their retina thickness is not reduced, so protected. But if the person who experienced being bullied in early teenage years and then also experiences poor school climate in high school years, so their retina thickness is significantly decrease. So, as I said, retina thickness is the marker of early aging, early accelerating aging. Yes. So, we think the importance of good school climate for adolescent. Yes. This is the final slide. So recently, our research team and Tokyo Metropolitan Government have teamed up to launch a school climate improvement project in Tokyo. So this April, we started a pilot initiative. We are now implementing this project, receiving advice from the Bikram Patel, a professor in Harvard Medical School. The Bikram Patel lead Indian's school climate intervention program and achieved a great success, and the result was published in The Lancet. Their intervention reduced bullying by 90% and significantly improved children's mental health in India. We are currently working on developing a school climate intervention program to implement in Tokyo schools. So we will report on the result as the next opportunity. Thank you for your listening. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Professor Nishida, for your excellent presentation. First of all, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to such a full audience. Not always the case at academic conferences, so yeah, really appreciate that. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about some work that was conducted as part of a program that was ongoing when I was working for Professor Nishida's team in Tokyo at the Tokyo Metropolitan Institute of Medical Science. The aim of this project was to investigate living circumstances and mental health outcomes among young carers in Tokyo. We know from international evidence on young carers that being a carer in youth is a risk for mental health. We know that, first of all, that between about 2 to 10% of all teenagers are caregiving for either a sick relative, for a parent, for a grandparent, or for a sibling. The definitions do vary a lot between different studies, and so that's why we have this quite wide prevalence estimate. And there's lots of additional things that kind of complicate this exact percentage further, such as the fact that the intensity by which people are caregiving, whether it's kind of every day, a couple of times a week, and there's kind of specific duties that are being carried out, they somewhat complicate the picture, but as far as kind of quantitative data and surveys are concerned, we kind of arrive at somewhere between this 2 to 10% estimate. And systematic reviews of mental health outcomes amongst young carers show that pretty much whichever way you slice it, no matter how you define mental health, whether you're talking in terms of anxiety, depression, in terms of behavioral problems, peer problems, self-esteem, we know that risks are higher amongst young carers. Furthermore, it doesn't just extend to mental health problems. We know that physical health problems are also more likely among young carers. This can include things such as sleep problems. It can be increased obesity, for example. And we therefore think that kind of young caring is something that's a risk transdiagnostically and deserves to be intervened in and of itself. We also, from not just a public health perspective, but from an economic perspective, have a strong incentive to support young carers, because we know that young carers are less likely to go on to pursue further education and are less likely to both find jobs and remain in stable employment when they find them. However, quantitative data is limited in what it can tell us, and what is currently available is limited in what it can tell us. The data that we currently have available predominantly comes from majority white English-speaking Western countries. And in fact, I think the two systematic reviews that I'm citing here, they found that of 20 data sets available, 10 of them were from the UK alone. The UK has a very strong history of researching young carers, but the rest of the world doesn't quite have the same data available. And to date, there are very few studies in Japan that have looked at the extent of young caregiving and the effects of young caregiving. So that kind of sets some of the background for where this work comes from. We also have a reason to think that Japan's a specific example where young caregiving is going to be important and relevant for kind of future demographic issues. Atsushi also already made reference to the fact that Japan is an aging society. I think the estimate is something like 30% of all adults will be over the age of 65 by 2030. Or it may even be that that's already the case. I'd have to check the exact figures, but it's somewhere around there. And we also know that about 1 in 5 of the elderly are predicted to have dementia. We already know that the caregiving burden of an aging society is falling on informal caregivers. According to government surveys, around 30% of adults with caregiving needs report a non-spouse family member as their primary caregiver, and in the majority of cases, those are people that they're cohabiting with. It's mostly adult children, but not always. It can include grandchildren as well. Although we don't have very fine, the data that produced that figure is not very fine-grained. It's from a relatively small sample and from convenience sampling, which may not be representative of the population. Nonetheless, young caregiving has in recent years become a more pressing political issue and something that's been talked about more in society, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, really since kind of COVID ended. There was an NHK documentary on the nature of young caregiving in Japan in 2022, and the following year, although I don't believe these things are necessarily linked, but kind of are broadly a result of kind of growing awareness in general following COVID. The Tokyo Metropolitan Government launched a policy directive called Action for Children's Futures, in which they identified 6 different groups of young people, or kind of demographics of young people that they identified as kind of in particular need of support, one of which was young carers and carers for grandparents and parents. There was also, shortly following this kind of local government initiative, a national public awareness campaign by the Child and Families Agency, where they tried to make people aware of what a young carer is. You may see, I think it's written on this poster somewhere, that the word young carer in Japan is young kera, which is an English transliteration, and so may not be immediately kind of familiar to people who are conducting caregiving. And that's kind of what the focus of this campaign was. So as a result of this, I think Atsushi mentioned that the Tokyo Metropolitan Institute of Medical Science, it's a government institute and often receives kind of requests for research and kind of more recent local data relative to specific policies that they are either thinking of implementing, considering implementing, or already implementing. And these were the kind of answers, these are the questions that they wanted Atsushi's research team to answer. What are the demographic and household characteristics of young carers in Tokyo, and what are their mental health outcomes? We also thought that given we had the data available, that we could look at caregiving duration and age effects, which has not in international research previously been investigated. So again, I'm conscious that I might be slightly repeating some of the previous presentation here, but as a quick recap, the Tokyo Teen Cohort Study, which is the data set that is managed by Atsushi's team, is the Tokyo Teen Cohort, and it currently has 4 data waves available with the 5th wave ongoing. Data was collected at bi-yearly intervals, 10, 12, 14, and 16 years. Has about 3,000 children and parents involved in the study, and they're currently aged about 20 years old. So when data started to be collected, they were about 10 years old and have been followed in those age brackets since then. At each of those waves, this survey asked a question to the primary caregiver, so the parents of the child. How often is your child looking after someone within your family who is elderly or has an illness or disability? We went for quite a strict definition of young carer, and if anyone's interested, I can talk a bit more about that. But we kind of deliberated a bit about what we should count as our definition of young carer in this case. But we found that the people who are caring most frequently are the ones that are identified in previous research as at the greatest risk of mental health problems. So we went with this quite stringent definition of people who are caregiving every day or almost every day. Within that, we also split those groups into short-term carers who were from ages 10 to 16 reported being a young carer at one time, and long-term carers which were 2 or more. And then we were comparing the demographic characteristics of this group to people who were not caregiving during that same time period. So these were the figures that we found for them. At each of these years here, so we've got kind of cross-sectional associations between demographic characteristics on the left and the time that the parent was answering on behalf of their child. In terms of kind of consistent associations that we found kind of throughout, we found that broadly speaking, young carers were more likely to be girls and more likely to be cohabiting with grandparents, with some evidence to suggest that low income households, that's slightly wrong there, were also more likely to have young caregivers. And that's consistent with the picture that we found, or that researchers have found previously internationally as well. When we look longitudinally, when we sort of think, instead we kind of turn the question on its head, which is, if someone is this characteristic at 10 years, how much more likely than non-carers, how much more likely are they than someone who is not that characteristic to become a young carer? We can look at whether they're likely to become short-term or longer-term carers. And once again, we see the same characteristics that, broadly speaking, girls are more likely, and those who are cohabiting with grandparents are more likely. Interestingly, in this analysis, we didn't find any particular association with low annual income. We did also investigate number of siblings, since that had been identified in previous international literature. We didn't find any particular association in this data set. And similarly, we didn't really find for single-parent households, although, again, it's a somewhat kind of mixed picture, as we'll see in a little bit later on. So that was kind of the first program of research, was who are these young carers? What are their household characteristics? Now we kind of go on to think, so we kind of have identified these young carers, what are their mental health outcomes? And we were interested in 3 in particular. The first was depression, which was, we used the 13-item survey, which is kind of internationally recognized measure of depression. There are some concerns with it, and the quantitative data is limited, but broadly speaking, this is a slightly more granular detail, and you get a little bit more variation than if you ask kind of single questions or you ask people to report if they are themselves depressed. We then also asked single items around self-harm within the last year and suicidal ideation, which asks about whether people feel that their life is no longer worth living. So these were the three that we were taking into account for our next set of analyses on mental health. We also used a slightly different longitudinal definition of young caregiving here, and bear with me through this slightly overly detailed slide, but we put together each set of two waves into a caregiving duration variable, where we had young caregiving at the time period before the mental health outcome and at the same time period as the mental health outcome. So kind of as is described on this grid here, people who are caregivers at 2 time points we consider long-term carers. People who are caregivers at the closest time point to the outcome are new caregivers. And then we excluded carers who had been a caregiver at a previous time point but not the most recent one. And then we compared them to those who were not carers and had not reported being so over the last 2 years. So when we set these analyses up, this is the kind of picture we came out with. At 12 years, we don't really see any convincing effects on mental health. And that's true for both new carers and long-term caregivers. I mean, the point estimates are slightly estimated, but as you can see with these error bars, we're not really seeing anything too convincing here. I should say that for people who are not familiar with this kind of data presentation, the further right the dot is and the further the point is in this direction, the more likely than your reference group this is to occur. So in this case, we're comparing whether depression is more likely among new and long-term caregivers. Yeah, we don't see that there's any particular elevated effects. However, as we go up the years, and we start seeing, although self-harm and suicidality do not show any convincing effects, we do start seeing an effect in depression being elevated at 14 years. And then going up again to age 16, we actually see that although depression is no longer elevated, we do start seeing it amongst self-harm and suicidality. And so the way that we're interpreting this is that it seems as young carers get older, that the mental health outcomes become more serious and perhaps more deleterious. And just to kind of finish off this particular statistical part of the presentation, we also look, the previous associations were kind of what we call crude, so we're not adjusting for any things that we think could be confounding those associations. But the same broad pattern of associations remains when we adjust for gender, low income status, single parent household, and parental distress. So we think that these associations are genuine, that they're not explained in terms of other demographic characteristics that might be underpinning some associations that could potentially explain these associations. So to kind of sum up, from this program of work, we found that young carers in Tokyo were more likely to be girls, more likely to come from low-income households with some caveats, and much more likely to be living with their grandparents. We also found that longer-term caregiving in particular was associated with much greater mental health risk, particularly for those at older ages, in our case 16 being the oldest age. The conclusions that we take from this are that early identification and practical support is absolutely necessary for young carers, because we can see that even compared to caregiving for shorter periods of time, those who are caregiving for longer are more likely to exhibit mental health problems. That being said, we know that quantitative data does have some limitations, and there are some that we must acknowledge with this as well. Given that this is a set of survey questions, we can't ask, or we didn't have the space in this case to ask, who was being looked after, the nature of the caregiving, and although we had duration, we didn't have intensity. So yeah, we couldn't kind of look within kind of more fine-grained detail at each of those time points. And so that's particularly interesting in the case of young caregivers, because we know from qualitative studies and from interviews with young carers that there can be, at the same time as mental health problems, also mental health benefits to being a young caregiver. In particular, things like kind of a sense of pride and a sense of social connection and of strong social support with family members of those who they are caring for. So as a quantitative researcher, this can be quite confusing, that you can have potentially positive and negative mental health effects at the same time. But yeah, these are the kind of things that quantitative research is unfortunately not able to kind of look in fine-grained detail for. We're looking at averages across groups. So I think that is pretty much the end of this presentation. The only other thing to say that I found yesterday, and so apologies, this is rather hastily put in here, the Japan Times actually ended up writing an article about this program of work, which was really great for us. So we were very pleased to see that. But if you have any other questions about it, I'll be happy to take them at the end. And thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful, thanks, Dan. And you know what? I've been looking for that photo all day and I couldn't find it anywhere. So clearly, your filing system's better than mine. Hi, everybody. I'm Gemma. I'm a lecturer in epidemiology and youth mental health at the Centre for Society and Mental Health at King's College London. It's a real pleasure, privilege to be here and to be able to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes talking about our relatively new but recently funded programme of a joint programme of research on youth mental health in London and in Tokyo and more widely in the UK and Japan. And I promise I'm not just doing this to suck up because we're here at Daiwa Foundation, but we do owe a massive thanks because without the scholarship that Dan was awarded by Daiwa Foundation to go over to Japan a few years back and ultimately work with Atsushi's team, then this collaboration never would have come about, and we certainly wouldn't be in the exciting position that we are right now. And the reason it's exciting and the reason that this presentation is really timely for us and a really great opportunity is that we, over the last about 9 months of grafting, have been working together on a funding application that we submitted to the Wellcome Trust for an international programme of research that we just found out 2 weeks ago is funded and will start in the autumn and last for the next 5 years. So the reason this is a great opportunity for us is it's the first time we're going to speak about this in a kind of public realm and really warmly welcome any input, any feedback, any ideas that you might have, because as you might see as I outline the programme of work, there are a number of challenges, difficulties that we need to kind of work out as we go. And I'm sure there's a lot of knowledge in this room that could contribute to helping us navigate those challenges. So I was going to, no, I'll do it later. All right, so I'm just going to start with a bit of background about the problem for anyone who's not the problem that we set out to address, if anyone who's not familiar. So the programme of work that we've proposed to do is to try to understand and find solutions to the problem of sex differences in emotional health, so anxiety, depression, eating disorders, self-harm and so on, among teenage girls compared with teenage boys. So just for a bit of background, this is data from the REACH study, which is the cohort study we run in London. It's a study of youth mental health where we've been following around 4,000 young people over time to understand what kinds of experiences and conditions influence young people's mental health trajectory, and ultimately try and find ways then to reduce inequalities in mental health for young people from different backgrounds. And one of the things that's been quite striking about the work we've done so far is this sex difference or gender difference in emotional health in adolescents. So on the left, this is just an average trajectory of emotional health scores, if you like, in boys and in girls. And as you see on the left, in year 7, so this is around age 11 to 12, mental health is quite similar between boys and girls. That's also the case in primary school years, possibly even slightly worse among boys than among girls. But then through secondary school, you see this quite clear divergence of emotional health between boys and girls. And by around age 14, 15, 16, we see around a 2 to 3-fold higher rates of anxiety, depression, eating disorders and self-harm among girls compared with boys. Based on our data, this seems to happen quite consistently irrespective of your ethnic group or your socioeconomic status, the age at which these differences emerge. But more recently, there's been evidence suggesting that this kind of gender mental health gap, if you like, it varies from place to place and from time to time. So, for example, the work we did suggests that girls' mental health improved and the gap between boys and girls' mental health narrowed during the first phase of COVID. And there's recently been some international work suggesting that some of the largest or the worst kind of inequalities in emotional health between teenage boys and girls happens in Europe, and particularly Western Europe, and they're smaller and possibly even reversed in other countries. And so this is where our collaboration began, really. Well, I had the privilege of being invited over to Tokyo for a month about a year and a half ago to spend time with Atsushi's team. And what we tried to do with my time there was to ask the question, according to that recent evidence that had been published, we have better quality data than that work that had been done. So, and we could do something a bit more robust in terms of measurement, which maybe I could talk about later. But we wanted to ask the question, is this gender inequality in mental health really worse in the UK or London compared with Tokyo? Because it's an intriguing thing if it is. And the work that we did, which I can talk a bit more about later, I won't linger too much on it, but it sets a foundation, again, suggests that although there are differences in mental health in the teenage years between boys and girls in both places, the gap between boys and girls is around twice as large in London by age 16 as it is in Tokyo. And that rate of increase, this is annual increase in depressive symptoms among girls, is around 4 times steeper in London than in Tokyo. Now, we don't have a good understanding of why these differences exist. And I think it's really important to kind of just stop for a second and explain that this isn't a new problem, that you can go back decades in the literature to find this data that shows, for example, recently evidence on young people who were born in the 1950s. This inequality in mental health is similar then as it is now, even though overall rates of mental health problems seem to have increased among young people. And so despite decades of scientific and methodological progress, we somehow still don't understand this problem. We don't understand why it happens at this stage of the life course, and critically, we don't know whether it can be prevented. Broadly, I'm just going to check my order of my slides. The last time I used these slides was at a funding pitch to Wellcome, and I'm slightly traumatized by it, to be honest, and I keep reverting automatically back into that spiel. Sorry, I'm not asking you for money, I promise. So we think there are probably broadly 3 main reasons why we don't have a good understanding of this issue. The first is that typically, because of the age at which this difference emerges, typically there's been a lot of focus on the role of puberty. And it, by implication, is then the role of biological sex. But we now know from work that's been done in older ages, say in adults, that sexism, misogyny, gender inequality are causes of emotional health problems among women and do explain a large part of the gender inequality in mental health in later life. But sexism as a possible cause of this onset in emotional health or worse health among girls in teenage years tends to be overlooked because there is such a focus on puberty and biological sex. And the second reason we think that there's been lack of progress, and linked to the first point, is that typically researchers have worked within disciplinary silos on this problem. So you've got the biologists studying the biology, the social scientists studying the social science, and so on. But we now know that the world is, and it's probably common sense, the world is far more complex than that. And so studying things in isolation doesn't give us a good understanding of the problem. We now know, as Dr. Nishida presented earlier, our social experiences can influence our biological processes. And so everything that we think we know about biological differences, say in stress response and so on, between boys and girls and men and women, could in fact be due to social experience or gender socialization and so on. And the third point, and critically, is that typically in this area of research, young people's voices have not been heard. So the research that's been done has been designed and delivered, and the hypotheses have been generated by scientists and not by young people themselves. So over the last kind of 12 to 18 months, we've been working with young people in both sites to try and understand how they see this problem and what they think the possible solutions might be. In a series of workshops, and these do weight slightly towards the London group because we had slightly further ahead on the co-production mechanisms here, but we are building in Tokyo. Over a series of workshops, sexism was a recurring and prominent theme. And when we asked young girls if we could change 5 to 10 things that would bring about the biggest improvement in teenage girls' mental health, what would those things be? What should we change? The kinds of things they talked to us about are immense social pressures to look a certain way or be a certain way, double standards in the home or in school around, say, chores and so on, and roles, Sexual harassment, feeling unsafe from quite an early age, Andrew Tate attitudes, so influences online, and puberty being scrutinized in girls and praised in boys. And we have, as the bottom here, you'll see we have this is our office wall at the moment. There are post-it notes everywhere from the 120 odd young people who have contributed ideas to this project. We also have a mind map that's in Japanese, but given that I can't read it and you might ask me a question about it, I thought I'd better leave it out. Maybe Dan could have read it for me. So what we've done is try to take this information that's currently sitting on our wall in our office, all these sticky notes, and with young people design a program of research that tries to kind of, I guess, blow this issue apart and trying to understand if we can prevent this thing from happening in the first place. So over the next, so we've incredibly lucky to be awarded a multi-million-pound grant for this work over the next 5 years, which I'm incredibly excited about. I'm also slightly nervous about the sake-induced hangovers that seem to happen each time I spend time with Atsushi's team, but maybe I'll get there eventually. And we're motivated by the question, in a world free of sexism, would sex differences in emotional health exist? Now, of course, that world doesn't exist, so it's very hard to recreate it. But we can do some fancy stuff. Well, I can't. Dario can. Give us a wave, Dario. Can do some fancy stuff with statistical methods to try to kind of create or imagine that counterfactual world existed. And we can do that with existing data sources that we have in our team with REACH, in Nishida-sensei's team with TTC and the population neuroscience study and other studies here, which I'll talk about more in a second. So we have 4 goals. I'm going to go slightly backwards, but what we want to do is first we need to try to demonstrate the causal link between sexism and anxiety and depression at this age. Second is to understand the mechanisms through which the impacts of sexism are carried. So why is it that sexism, or how is it that sexism impacts girls' emotional health? And we want to do this at multiple levels. We want to understand how does sexism influence brain development and in turn mental health, biological processes and in turn mental health, and psychosocial development, so things like physical activity, diet and lifestyle and so on, self-esteem, and how these in turn influence mental health. We also then want to understand why there's variation, as I showed earlier, in the mental health trajectories of girls in London and Tokyo. And so we will do all of this work, which I'll describe in a second, in both Tokyo and in London, or at least we'll try. Ganbatte. And we'll see how we get on. But to be able to do all of this, to be able to kind of quantify these things, we first need a much better understanding, we think, of the lived experience of teenage girls in both sites, and to understand how to measure and quantify that experience so that we can do this kind of quantitative work that shows that link and those mechanisms. So we've designed 3 work packages over the 5 years. The first one is a qualitative program of work, which basically means we're going to recruit young people as researchers in our team. We're going to interview young people in both sites from a range of ages from 10 to 24. We're going to try and understand their experience. And then we're going to try and work with that group of young people to understand how to measure that experience. And what we do with that information is basically going to shape what we do in the second and third work package. So in the second work package, we're going to use data from these amazing cohort studies that we already have access to, REACH, TTC, the population neuroscience study that Professor Kasai and Nishida-sensei lead, and other studies, Millennium Cohort Study and others. And we're going to work with young people to create kind of like as our exposure, like a sexism indices that have been informed by young people's experience, and look at then the causal link with the development of anxiety and depression. In the third work package, we're going to do something that's a bit intensive. We're going to have to work really hard to engage young people in this side of it. We're going to do something called experience sampling, which is a method that we can use to try to understand kind of the real-time unfolding of like how your experiences on a daily basis influence you on a daily basis, and in that like real-time type approach. So we can use things like watches and wearables, phone apps, some new developments in biological sampling and so on, to understand, in particular in work package 3, how is the social experience influencing biological processes and compounding biological processes like, for example, the menstrual cycle, to contribute to higher levels of anxiety and depression. I've gone ahead and talked you through our slides. In the second half of the program, the first work package then becomes like what kind of like a vehicle for impact. So we really want, as you probably get in the impression, we want youth voice to be front and center in this. So the findings from work package 2 and 3 are then going to feed back into work package 1, where all of our young co-researchers are, and they're going to then drive, hopefully we can engage people. It's been going quite well so far. Drive kind of policy recommendations and so on that might come from this work in both sites. I think I've done a bit of this. If you want to know anything about the statistics, then Dario over there. You're getting 2 shout-outs, Dario. Just to kind of introduce you to the team of people, there were far more people than this, but I couldn't snap so many images into the Canva thingy to do this. But just to pick out some people who will be leading some areas of the program. So we have, it's a multidisciplinary team, including neuroscientists, social scientists, epidemiologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, who have I missed, qualitative researchers, Dan. And it's really an amazing team to work with, so it's a real honour. We have partners in Germany who are experts in that kind of real-time tracking methods that I talked about earlier as well. I've left this slide in from the interview purely to say that, of course, I've made the point that young people are really key to all of this, but it's also an incredible opportunity for us to learn from one another across sites. And for me in particular, I've been really impressed when I've spent time in Tokyo to see just how impactful in terms of like policy impact and real life change Dr. Nishida's work is. He really, really works hard to make sure that the research he does leads to real life change, and that's something that here I don't think we're quite so good at. So I'm really, it's an honour to have the opportunity to learn from Nishida Sensei and his team on that. And likewise, co-production and youth involvement in research is relatively well established here and now is pretty much kind of mandated by funders. But in Japan, it's in its infancy, and arguably the stuff that Nishida Sensei and Professor Kasai have been doing is kind of at the cutting edge of that. And what we're hoping to do is be able to work together on involving young people in the research in Japan as well. In terms of what we hope to achieve from this, if our hypotheses are true, if they're supported at the end of this work, then for me, I think one of the critical things is changing public understanding and shifting opinions and narratives about girls' mental health. Typically, at the moment, at least in the UK, the policy response to high and rising rates of anxiety and depression in girls is very much to put the onus on the individual. So offer things like, let's learn how to do mindfulness, or let's do some CBT, or so on. But if these problems are structural, which we already know is the case in relation to things like racism and poverty and so on, so it makes sense it would also be true of sexism, it would then require a different kind of approach to tackling this problem. And we can maybe say more about some things like that. Arigatou gozaimasu. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and there's too many people to list, but thank you very much to everybody involved. Thank you.